For centuries, the words of Amos have stood at the edge of biblical memory, familiar in outline, yet rarely explored with the depth and seriousness they command. His voice does not rise from palace courts, trained prophetic guilds, or priestly schools. It comes instead from the rugged landscape of the Judean highlands, from a man whose hands were shaped by the labor of tending sheep and cultivating sycamore figs. The world he stepped into was already under tension, with empires expanding, borders shifting, and injustices deepening beneath layers of prosperity. Even in modern scholarship, the abruptness of his appearance still invites questions. Why him? Why then? What compelled a rural figure to confront the centers of northern authority with such uncompromising force? Before he ever reached the sanctuaries of the northern kingdom, Amos witnessed the early rumblings of a world changing under the pressure of Assyria's growing power. Archaeological evidence from the 9th and 8th centuries reveals shifting trade routes, increased demand for tribute, and instability in peripheral states. The shepherd from Tekoa lived at a crossroads where pastoral life met imperial aggression. His village, positioned on the edge of wilderness and cultivated land, offered him daily reminders of natural cycles, seasons that could turn from abundance to disaster in a single year. These rhythms later shaped the metaphors that filled his oracles, blending the intimate knowledge of land with divine warning. The opening of his message is unconventional for ancient prophetic literature. It does not begin with Israel, but with the nations surrounding it. Damascus, Gaza, Tyre, Edom, Ammon, Moab. Each appears in a form of indictment rooted in actions remembered across the Levant. Scholars draw attention to parallels between these accusations and war crimes recorded in royal inscriptions from the same period. Cities endured forced deportations, scorched earth campaigns, and acts of brutality meant to terrify populations into submission. The oracles of Amos echo these realities with stark clarity. Rather than isolated spiritual admonitions, they reflect situations documented by both archaeology and Near Eastern diplomatic texts. Yet, Amos did not speak as a nationalist rallying his people against foreign powers. His condemnations of surrounding nations form only the outer ring of a larger, more unsettling message. That outer ring, geographically organized as if spiraling inward, eventually turns against Judah and Israel themselves. This pattern resembles the rhetorical strategies found in ancient covenant lawsuits, where accusations widen until the final target stands exposed. When Amos directs his message toward his own people, he does so by linking their fate to the same moral expectations placed upon all nations. In an age where each kingdom justified its actions through divine favor, Amos presents an alternative. Ethical demands rooted not in political convenience, but in a transcendent sense of justice. The world that Amos entered in the north was outwardly prosperous. Excavations at Samaria reveal ivory carvings, luxury vessels, and architectural structures indicating wealth concentrated among the elite. These findings align with his criticisms of those reclining on beds of ivory, adorned with fineries, while turning away from the suffering of the marginalized. The archaeological record offers silent testimony, confirming that his warnings were not abstractions, but interventions into a society divided by excess and exploitation. Prosperity had not brought stability. It had produced complacency and a widening moral distance between rulers and the poor. As Amos traveled into the northern kingdom, he encountered sanctuaries that functioned as both religious centers and instruments of royal authority. Bethel, in particular, played a central role in northern identity. Inscriptions and cultic remains from similar highland sanctuaries show how alternative worship traditions evolved after the kingdom's separation from Judah. These places did not merely serve spiritual functions. They reinforced political legitimacy and economic control. When Amos spoke against these centers, he challenged more than ritual practice. He confronted the very structures that gave the monarchy its ideological power. What distinguishes Amos is the clarity with which his message links divine expectation to social ethics. The prophetic tradition before him often focused on idolatry or royal conduct, but Amos elevated justice as a central measure of national survival. Earlier ancient Near Eastern texts, such as those from Mesopotamian kings, included themes of justice and mercy as ideals. Yet Amos presents these not as royal virtues, but as demands placed upon entire communities. This shift redefines responsibility. It moves the locus of divine evaluation from palace halls to marketplaces, fields, and courts, places where the poor were often mistreated and where corruption shaped daily life. The tone of his proclamations draws heavily from the world he knew as a shepherd. Imagery of roaring lions, devastated pastures, and threatened harvests reflects the lived experience of someone accustomed to reading signs in the land. The shepherd in biblical literature symbolizes both protection and vulnerability. For Amos, the land's fragility mirrored Israel's precarious moral state. Agricultural metaphors become warnings embedded in the natural rhythms of the region. Locusts that devour fields, droughts that empty rivers, and harvests ruined by scorching winds. These were realities familiar enough to serve as powerful illustrations of divine judgment. At the center of his opening proclamations lies a declaration of divine universality. The God Amos presents is not confined to the fortunes of Israel, but judges all nations by the same standards. This theme is supported by parallel ideas in early Jewish literature, where God is described as guiding the migrations and destinies of various peoples. The notion challenges the exclusivity that many kingdoms claimed for their patron deities. For Amos, divine authority extends beyond borders, empires, and tribal identities. This expansive vision positions his message within a framework that includes every nation under moral evaluation. As his warnings circulate, tensions mount. The northern kingdom is increasingly entangled in regional politics, subject to shifting alliances and the looming threat of Assyria. Archaeologists uncover evidence of military reforms and defensive structures from this period, suggesting that leaders anticipated conflict long before it reached their borders. The prophet's voice, emerging from a rural background, enters this atmosphere as both challenge and revelation. His message is not merely spiritual but geopolitical. Unchecked injustice weakens a society from within, making it vulnerable to external catastrophe. By the time Amos delivers his earliest oracles in the north, he stands as a figure shaped by landscapes, economic pressures, political instability, and divine compulsion. He is neither a mystic detached from society nor a political rebel seeking power. He occupies a unique position, an outsider whose authority derives from truth rather than status. The shepherd from Tekoa, carrying a message forged in the solitude of the wilderness, now confronts kingdoms with warnings that resonate across manuscripts, inscriptions, and historical landscapes. His arrival marks the beginning of a confrontation between prophetic integrity and national pride. The northern sanctuaries, fortified by royal support, view him with suspicion. The elites, benefiting from wealth accumulated through trade and taxation, dismiss his warnings. Yet the evidence of instability, economic disparities, shifting alliances, environmental stress echoes beneath every stratum of daily life. And in this tension, the narrative of Amos begins, a solitary voice revealing the consequences of a world drifting away from justice. As Amos's voice continued to echo across the northern kingdom, the structure of his message became increasingly clear. The God he proclaimed held every nation accountable, not just the one he was addressing. This idea may feel familiar to modern readers, but within the ancient world it carried enormous weight. Deities were commonly understood as territorial and national. Assyrian kings invoked their gods in inscriptions to justify conquests. Phoenician rulers credited divine patronage for trade success. Moabite kings carved victories into stone and attributed them to Chemosh. Each kingdom believed its deity's influence stopped at nearby borders. Against this backdrop, Amos declared something radical, that one divine authority evaluated all nations by the same ethical standard, regardless of political allegiance or cultural identity. When Amos pronounced judgments on Damascus, Gaza, Tyre, Edom, Ammon, and Moab, his words were not poetic abstractions, but reflections of historical trauma. Archaeological layers from these regions reveal destruction, forced migrations, and power struggles consistent with the actions condemned in his oracles. Damascene cruelty toward Gilead is paralleled in records of Aramean conflicts that emphasize border raids and massacres. Gaza's participation in regional slave trading aligns with discoveries of trade routes linking coastal cities with inland markets. Tyre's betrayals reflect the shifting alliances documented in Phoenician treaties. Each condemnation, though brief in the biblical text, resonates with the harsh realities of the Iron Age. What makes the oracles even more striking is how Amos presents them. He does not celebrate the downfall of Israel's enemies, something many listeners might have welcomed. Instead, he constructs a ring of judgment that tightens around Israel itself. This rhetorical pattern appears in ancient covenant texts, where accusations mount until the true target is revealed. The nations listed by Amos form a geographic circle that narrows inward, preparing his audience for a revelation they do not expect. As he moves from foreign capitals to Israel's heartland, his earlier accusations serve as a mirror. The same violence, injustice, and betrayal found abroad now appear within the borders of the northern kingdom. To understand the force of his critique, one must consider the northern kingdom's political and economic climate. Under the reign of Jeroboam II, Israel enjoyed a period of unusual expansion and prosperity. Military victories restored previously lost territories, and commerce brought wealth into the region. Excavations in Samaria and surrounding cities show evidence of lavish homes with intricate ivory inlays, imported goods, and expensive furnishings. This archaeological record matches the prophet's indictments of elites reclining in luxury while ignoring the plight of the poor. The prosperity, however, was uneven. Rural villages bore the burden of taxation and labor, and social stratification deepened significantly. This disparity becomes one of Amos's central concerns. Amos's denunciations target practices that scholars recognize as characteristic of ancient exploitative systems. debt slavery, land foreclosure, and corrupt judicial proceedings appear in texts across the Near East. The poor were often forced to sell their land, or even themselves, when crop failure or drought reduced their means of survival. Wealthy landowners consolidated estates through legal pressure, manipulating courts, or lending terms in their favor. The prophet's critiques of those selling the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, while not quoted here in verse form, correspond closely to documented patterns of economic oppression from the period. His warnings highlight the fragility of communities built on exploitation. As his message spread, Amos used imagery rooted in agricultural life, an approach that carried deep meaning for both rural and urban listeners. The threat of locust swarms, for example, resonated across generations. Tablet records from Mesopotamia describe entire harvests lost to swarms that darkened the sky. The prophet's allusions to droughts, withheld rains, blighted crops, and diseases affecting vineyards match regional environmental cycles confirmed by paleoclimatology. These conditions were not mere metaphors, but tangible dangers that shaped survival. By invoking them, Amos connected divine judgment with the rhythms of the land, reinforcing that social injustice had consequences reaching into daily life. Within this broader atmosphere, the sanctuaries of Bethel and Dan held significant authority. These sites, established in the early days of the Northern Kingdom, were not merely religious alternatives to Jerusalem. They functioned as symbols of political independence. Archaeologists studying Highland cultic sites find altars, ritual installations, and objects that reflect variations of Israelite worship distinct from Judah's traditions. The sanctuaries served as centers of economic administration, pilgrimage, and royal propaganda. Their priests benefited from close ties to the monarchy, and religious rites reinforced both divine favor and political legitimacy. Thus, when Amos warned of judgment falling upon these sites, he struck directly at the ideological foundations of the kingdom. The prophetic conflict that emerged was not simply theological, but institutional. Prophets who operated independently, outside state-sanctioned religious structures, often clashed with royal administrations. Inscriptions from surrounding cultures show how kings valued prophetic voices that supported political agendas while suppressing those that threatened them. The tension between Amos and the northern priesthood mirrors this pattern. His message disrupted the expected religious narrative, one that assured the people of divine protection and national security. Instead of affirming prosperity as a sign of blessing, Amos declared it evidence of moral decay. Another dimension of his message involved the concept of divine election. Many in Israel believed that their chosen status insulated them from destruction. Ancient traditions emphasized a special covenant. Festivals reinforced national memory, and priests taught that their relationship with God granted unique favor. Amos challenged this assumption directly. He insisted that election implied responsibility rather than privilege. Early Jewish writings echo this reinterpretation, presenting God as the one who guides all nations and judges them impartially. The prophetic perspective reframed Israel's identity, chosen not for immunity, but for accountability. This confrontation with national self-understanding heightened the tension surrounding Amos's presence. People were accustomed to prophets who gave assurances of protection, who blessed military campaigns, or who offered ritual guidance. Instead, Amos predicted that external powers, ones already casting shadows across the region, would become instruments of judgment. Assyria, under rulers such as Adad-nirari and Tiglath-Pileser III, had begun expanding aggressively. Their annals describe campaigns through Syria and the Levant with devastating detail, including sieges, deportations, and tribute demands. The northern kingdom, though momentarily secure, stood in the path of this rising empire. Amos's message placed social injustice at the heart of national vulnerability. His warnings suggested that corruption, not military weakness, posed the greatest threat. Archaeological discoveries of unequal distribution of wealth, combined with records of administrative reforms, illuminate the internal pressures weighing on the kingdom. In regions where small farmers lost land, resentment grew. Where courts favored the wealthy, distrust spread. Where sacred sites reinforced political agendas, dissent was silenced. The prophet saw these conditions as signs of a deeper moral fracture. One of the most remarkable features of Amos's proclamations is how they connect external events with internal moral failings. He did not present foreign aggression as random geopolitical force. Instead, he interpreted it through the lens of covenantal ethics. This worldview permeates ancient Israelite literature, where historical events are often framed in moral terms. Yet Amos takes this further. He extends the principle beyond Israel, suggesting that all nations, regardless of covenant, stand under the same moral scrutiny. This idea anticipates later theological developments and appears in writings preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls, where divine judgment is portrayed as global rather than localized. As Amos's oracles circulated, they challenged long-held assumptions about religious identity, economic systems, and political stability. His message insisted that divine evaluation reached into the structures of daily life, into markets, courts, homes, and worship spaces. It confronted leaders who used religion to justify wealth. It unsettled those who relied on tradition to avoid self-examination. It exposed the uncomfortable truth that nations, like individuals, could drift into self-deception while outwardly prospering. The northern kingdom, despite its wealth, faced cracks beneath the surface. Trade networks depended on political alliances that could shift overnight. Local economies were vulnerable to drought and crop failure. Defenses, though strengthened, could not withstand an empire determined to expand. The prophet's voice illuminated these vulnerabilities, while urging his audience to recognize the spiritual roots of their instability. His proclamations were not shaped by pessimism, but by acute awareness of how societies fracture when justice collapses. In the midst of this, Amos maintained the posture of an outsider. He did not come seeking influence or status, nor did he attempt to establish a prophetic school. His identity as a shepherd and fig cultivator grounded his message in the realities of working life. This authenticity may have contributed to the force of his warnings. In a world shaped by hierarchical governance, an untrained prophet from a rural background carried a voice that could not easily be dismissed as political manipulation. His authority derived from the truth he spoke and the historical conditions that validated it. As his early proclamations drew the attention of priests, officials, and citizens, tension began to build around what Amos represented. A challenge to complacency, a disruption of comfort, a reminder that prosperity could mask the rot of injustice. His message expanded beyond individual accusations into a comprehensive portrayal of a nation at a crossroads. The warnings, though delivered in an ancient world, resonate with patterns recognized by historians and archaeologists who trace the rise and fall of societies across centuries. The world of Amos was approaching a breaking point. The shepherd prophet sensed what others refused to see. That moral erosion, left unchecked, erodes the foundations of kingdoms long before the foreign armies arrive. His voice, shaped by landscapes and seasons, continued to grow louder, preparing to unveil visions that would illuminate the consequences awaiting a nation standing on the threshold of irreversible change. As the message of Amos deepened, its focus shifted unmistakably from the outer nations toward the covenant people themselves. The earlier oracles against surrounding kingdoms had prepared the ground, exposing a pattern of violence, betrayal, and oppression familiar to the entire region. But now, the prophet turned his attention to Judah and most sharply to Israel. This progression was deliberate. By beginning with distant nations, Amos demonstrated that divine judgment operated according to universal principles rather than partisan loyalties. Yet he also crafted an escalating ring of accusation that inevitably drew his listeners inward, forcing them to confront their own failures with a clarity they had not anticipated. For many in Israel, the expectation of divine favor was woven into the fabric of national identity. Traditions of exodus, conquest, and covenant reinforced a sense of chosenness that shaped both political and religious ideology. Festivals celebrated deliverance. Rituals affirmed belonging. Priests taught that divine protection surrounded the nation. Over time, this belief hardened into a kind of moral insulation. As long as the sacrificial system operated, as long as worship continued in the sanctuaries, many assumed that their unique relationship with God guaranteed stability. Amos challenged this assumption at its root. He insisted that privilege without responsibility became a liability, and that divine election brought accountability rather than immunity. The prophet's accusations began with Judah, targeting their neglect of divine instruction and their misleading traditions. This brief mention of Judah, though less developed than his warnings to Israel, signaled that divine authority extended across both kingdoms. Judah, though smaller and less prosperous, was not exempt from moral scrutiny. But the primary weight of Amos's message fell upon Israel, whose prosperity and political expansion under Jeroboam II had created a striking contrast between external success and internal decay. The social injustices Amos described were not theoretical. Archaeological findings from Samaria and other northern cities reveal evidence of wealth accumulation concentrated among the elite. Houses with carved ivory decorations, imported luxury items, and large storage facilities indicate lifestyles far removed from the subsistence-level existence of many rural families. At the same time, excavations show signs of economic strain among poorer communities, including cramped dwellings, limited access to agricultural resources, and shifts in land ownership patterns. These discoveries match the prophet's portrayal of a society where the wealthy consumed the best of the land, while offering little protection to those struggling under the burden of debt and taxation. Amos emphasized practices widely recognized in ancient law codes and economic documents as forms of exploitation. Debt was one of the most powerful mechanisms by which the poor were trapped in cycles of suffering. Crop failure, illness, or drought could leave a family unable to repay a loan, leading to land forfeiture, indentured servitude, or social displacement. judicial corruption further aggravated these conditions. In many societies of the Iron Age, legal decisions favored those with wealth or influence, and bribery was a common means of manipulating outcomes. Amos's references to perverted justice reflect a system where the powerless had little recourse, and the wealthy insulated themselves from accountability. In addition to economic exploitation, the prophet attacked religious complacency. The sanctuaries at Bethel, Dan, Gilgal, and Beersheba had become centers of ritual activity that symbolized national identity and divine favor. Pilgrims traveled to these sites for festivals, sacrifices, and ceremonies intended to honor God and secure blessing. Yet Amos insisted that such worship, when divorced from ethical living, became null and even offensive. This perspective aligns with broader prophetic traditions that critique empty ritualism. But Amos's approach is particularly stark. He presents a divine voice that rejects festivals, offerings, and songs when they are accompanied by injustice. Scholars note that this link between ethical conduct and acceptable worship represents a core theme developed in later prophetic literature. The prophet's argument gained further weight from the geopolitical context of his age. Assyria was rising as the dominant imperial force in the region, and its military campaigns brought devastation to kingdoms unprepared for the scale of its aggression. Historical records describe sieges, deportations, and the integration of conquered territories into an administrative system that demanded high tribute. For smaller states like Israel, the threat of Assyria was existential. While Jeroboam's victories provided temporary security, the underlying instability remained. Amos saw that moral corruption weakened the internal cohesion necessary to withstand external pressure. This principle appears in various ancient writings, where social injustice is understood to bring divine displeasure that exposes nations to disaster. Amos's message often drew upon imagery from daily life to make his point unmistakable. When he described a lion roaring, he invoked the fear and urgency of an imminent threat. When he mentioned the plucking of fruit, he emphasized the finality of judgment drawing near. These images were woven into the cultural imagination of the region, where agricultural cycles determined survival and where natural dangers remained ever present. His metaphors did more than illustrate concepts. They connected divine warning to observable reality, grounding moral truths in the rhythms of the land. The prophet also employed historical references familiar to his audience. He reminded them of past events in which divine intervention shaped their story, not to celebrate those moments, but to reveal continuity between past and present. In early Jewish literature, such recollections serve as moral and theological anchors. Amos used them to show that divine action in history was not arbitrary, but purposeful, guiding nations toward justice and accountability. By linking past deliverance with present corruption, he highlighted a tragic irony. The people who had once experienced liberation now oppressed their own. One of the most challenging aspects of Amos's message was his insistence that religious devotion, when severed from ethical responsibility, became a source of condemnation rather than protection. Rituals performed at Bethel or Gilgal, though culturally significant, could not shield the nation from judgment. This critique aligns with themes found in the writings of Hosea, Micah, and later prophets, but Amos expressed it with a directness that made it impossible to ignore. Divine displeasure, he argued, was not provoked by lack of ritual, but by the presence of injustice, deceit, and violence within the community. As Amos continued to speak, his warnings accumulated with increasing urgency. He pointed to droughts, failed harvests, blights, and plagues as signs of divine correction, events that scholars identify as part of the environmental record of the era. These disasters often preceded or accompanied political instability, creating conditions that exacerbated social inequality. The prophet interpreted these events not as random misfortunes, but as opportunities for repentance that had gone unheeded. Archaeological and textual evidence supports the occurrence of such environmental fluctuations, revealing a landscape where survival was never guaranteed. Despite the severity of his warnings, Amos did not present judgment as inevitable without cause. He argued that change remained possible if the people pursued justice and righteousness. This emphasis on moral action reflects a broader biblical theme that divine judgment is not arbitrary but responsive to human choices. His repeated calls to seek good rather than evil, to defend the oppressed, and to restore integrity to the courts demonstrate that the prophet's message was not simply destructive. It was a call to transformation rooted in ethical responsibility. Still, the responses he received were mixed. Some dismissed him as a pessimist, undermining national confidence. Others saw him as a threat to religious institutions that upheld the monarchy. His critique of those who longed for the day of divine intervention, believing it would bring victory and vindication, challenged deeply held assumptions. He insisted that such a day would bring darkness rather than light unless the people addressed their moral failures. This reversal of expectation appears in later Jewish apocalyptic writings, where divine judgment is portrayed as both revealing and unsettling. As tensions grew, Amos confronted the painful truth that the society he addressed was drifting further from its foundational values. Wealth had distorted priorities. Rituals had overshadowed justice. National pride had replaced humility. The prophet's voice, though unwelcome in many places, continued to unveil these realities with uncompromising clarity. His warnings formed a portrait of a nation whose outward strength concealed inner fracture, whose religious devotion masked ethical neglect, and whose prosperity blinded it to the consequences of moral decay. This portrait was not shaped by abstract theology, but by observation, reflection, and the moral insights that emerged from the land itself. The shepherd prophet, familiar with the vulnerabilities of flocks and fields, recognized those same vulnerabilities in the society before him. As the cracks widened, his message moved beyond accusation toward the realm of visions, revelations that would expose the deeper dimensions of the judgment approaching. Before those visions would unfold, however, the groundwork had been laid in his critique of a people who had failed to embody the justice that defined their calling. As the prophetic voice of Amos moved from accusation toward revelation, his message assumed a new dimension. He no longer addressed only the visible injustices of courts, marketplaces, and sanctuaries. Instead, he unveiled a series of visions, symbolic revelations that exposed the spiritual condition of the nation with a clarity that ordinary speech could not deliver. These visions drew deeply from the agricultural world he knew, but they also reflected themes found across ancient Near Eastern traditions, where symbolic imagery conveyed truths that transcended daily experience. Scholars note that prophetic visions often served as interpretive keys, unlocking the meaning of historical events by placing them within a divine framework. For Amos, these images announced the gravity of the moment and signaled that the window for repentance was narrowing. The first vision involved locusts, a threat well documented in the ecological history of the region. Locust swarms, capable of consuming entire fields in hours, left communities vulnerable to famine and economic collapse. Ancient records from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Levant describe the terror they inspired, often interpreting them as signs of divine displeasure. When Amos described locusts forming at the beginning of the late growth, the crops reserved for the king's revenue, he drew attention to a crisis that would undermine both royal wealth and the survival of common people. The timing underscored the fragility of systems dependent on predictable harvests. In a society where life hinged on the success of each agricultural cycle, the threat of locusts symbolized the unraveling of social and political stability. The second vision depicted a consuming fire that devoured the deep subterranean waters and threatened to destroy cultivated land. Fire in ancient imagery often represented judgment, purification, or cosmic disruption. Its reach into the depths of the earth hinted at a force that extended beyond natural disaster. Some scholars connect this vision to periods of drought that affect both surface water and underground aquifers, conditions confirmed by climate studies of the region. In the world of Amos, such droughts could devastate livelihoods, weaken economies, and exacerbate social tensions. The vision's symbolic force lay in its portrayal of judgment, reaching into the foundational elements of life, the land and the water that sustained it. The third vision featured a plumb line, a tool used by builders to establish straightness, alignment, and stability. In the hands of the divine, it symbolized a standard by which the nation would be measured. Unlike the earlier visions, this one did not involve disaster that could be averted. It represented assessment and decision. In architectural contexts across the ancient Near East, the plumb line ensured precision, indicating whether a structure remained true or needed correction. Amos employed this familiar tool to demonstrate that the nation's moral framework had drifted off balance. The sanctuary and the monarchy, which once served as pillars of national identity, were now misaligned with the ethical foundation expected of them. The fourth vision introduced a basket of ripe summer fruit. At first glance, the image may appear benign, even comforting. Yet, in ancient Hebrew, the word for summer fruit echoes a term for end or conclusion. This linguistic connection forms the basis of the vision's meaning. The nation had reached a decisive moment, one that signaled finality rather than abundance. The imagery also reflects agricultural realities. Summer fruit, once ripe, must be consumed quickly. It cannot be stored indefinitely. In the context of Amos's message, the fruit represented a society whose moral decay had reached its peak. Just as ripe fruit signals the close of a season, the vision declared that the period of warning was drawing to a close. Each vision built upon the previous one, forming a progression from disaster that could still be mitigated to consequences that could no longer be avoided. The shift from pleas for mercy to declarations of finality marks a turning point in the narrative. Early Jewish writings often reflect this pattern, where prophetic warnings move from conditional judgments to irrevocable outcomes as a people persist in wrongdoing. For Amos, the visions illustrated a spiritual reality that no ritual, festival, or declaration of loyalty could mask. The nation's ethical foundation had eroded to a point where collapse appeared inevitable. In addition to providing symbolic revelations, the visions revealed the prophet's inner struggle. As he witnessed the early stages of judgment, locusts, and fire, he responded with intercession. His pleas reflected a tradition in which prophets acted as advocates for the people, appealing to divine mercy even when condemnation seemed justified. This role appears in the stories of Moses and Samuel, whose intercessions preserved the nation in times of crisis. Amos's petitions align with this tradition, demonstrating his compassion and concern for those he addressed. Yet, as the visions progressed, his ability to intercede diminished. The symbolic plumb line and the basket of fruit signaled that the period of mediation had reached its limit. The moral fractures within the society were too deep, and the consequences too imminent. The visions also mirrored broader cultural concepts of cosmic order. In ancient Mesopotamian texts, kings were responsible for upholding justice as a means of maintaining harmony between the human realm and the divine. Failure to do so resulted in disorder, manifested through natural disasters or military defeat. Similarly, Egyptian inscriptions emphasize the necessity of preserving balance, known as ma'at, to prevent chaos. Although Israel's theological framework differed from these systems, the underlying principle was similar. Ethical living maintained alignment with divine expectations. When that alignment collapsed, consequences followed. The plumb line vision encapsulated this theme by presenting the divine as a builder measuring the integrity of a structure that had begun to fail. The historical context intensifies the weight of these visions. The northern kingdom stood at the threshold of a period of dramatic upheaval. Assyria's rise had already reshaped the political landscape. Archaeological evidence reveals preparations for conflict, including fortification expansions and stockpiling of resources. Inscriptions from Assyrian kings describe military campaigns that reshaped the map of the Levant. Against this backdrop, the symbolism of Amos's visions takes on additional clarity. They were not abstract warnings, but vivid illustrations of vulnerabilities that would soon manifest in real historical events. The imagery of fruit ready to spoil also parallels patterns identified in social anthropology. Societies that experience rapid economic growth without corresponding ethical structures often reach a tipping point where internal instability accelerates decline. The wealth of Israel's elite insulated them from immediate consequences, but it also contributed to divisions that weakened communal bonds. Amos observed these fractures, recognizing that they made the nation susceptible to external domination. His vision of summer fruit was not only a theological message, but also an astute reading of social dynamics that historians and archaeologists continue to study. Another critical aspect of the visions is their relationship to the concept of the divine voice breaking into human affairs. Across the ancient world, visions were understood as moments of revelation in which the unseen realm intersected with the physical. They conveyed truths inaccessible through ordinary perception. Amos's experiences align with this pattern, yet his interpretations remain grounded in ethical and historical realities. The divine voice did not unveil secrets of the cosmos or complex rituals, but called attention to injustices that were already visible. This emphasis distinguishes Amos from apocalyptic literature that would emerge in later centuries. His revelations targeted the immediate moral condition of a nation on the verge of collapse. The public reception of these visions likely varied. Some may have dismissed them as dramatic warnings from an outsider who misunderstood the stability of the kingdom. Others may have been unsettled, recognizing parallels between the imagery and recent or ongoing events. Evidence from contemporary cultures suggests that omens and visions held significant influence over decision-making, especially among the elite. If Amos's message reached royal or priestly circles, it would have been perceived as a challenge to the prevailing narrative of prosperity and divine favor. The sanctuary at Bethel, with its role in national worship, stood particularly threatened by these revelations. The visions also illuminate the prophetic vocation itself. Amos did not seek this role, nor did he inherit a prophetic tradition. He emerged from the rhythms of rural life, called to deliver messages that confronted both ordinary citizens and powerful leaders. His visions reflect the tension between divine commission and human reluctance. They reveal a figure who understood the cost of speaking hard truths, but remained committed to his calling. This commitment shaped the trajectory of Israel's prophetic tradition, influencing later voices who echoed his emphasis on justice and righteousness. As the symbolic revelations accumulated, they painted a portrait of a nation at the threshold of a decisive moment. The agricultural imagery linked divine judgment to the land itself, reminding listeners that moral choices affected the stability of their environment. The builder's tool in the divine hand underscored the inevitability of evaluation. The ripe fruit signaled that time had reached its limit. Together, these visions demonstrated that the gap between divine expectation and national behavior had grown too wide to be ignored. The unfolding narrative of Amos reveals a progression from internal critique to cosmic warning, from social analysis to spiritual revelation. It shows how a shepherd prophet, equipped with insights drawn from daily life, confronted the realities of a kingdom whose foundations were crumbling beneath the weight of injustice. As his visions continued to sharpen in meaning, the prophet prepared to deliver messages that would not only expose the nation's vulnerabilities, but also ignite conflict with the religious establishment that claimed to speak on behalf of the divine. As the message of Amos intensified, it inevitably collided with the structures that upheld Israel's religious and political identity. No collision was more significant than his encounter at Bethel, the royal sanctuary that stood as a symbol of national legitimacy. For generations, the site had embodied the northern kingdom's spiritual independence. It was a place where priests served under royal appointment, where festivals attracted pilgrims, and where rituals affirmed political stability. To confront Bethel was to challenge the very heartbeat of the nation. And when Amos's voice reached its courts, the tension that had been quietly building finally erupted into open conflict. The priest who stood at the center of this confrontation was Amaziah, a figure whose authority derived from both religious tradition and royal backing. Priests of such sanctuaries played crucial roles in shaping public perception. They oversaw ceremonies, interpreted divine favor, and reinforced the monarchy's message. Archaeological excavations at comparable sites reveal administrative buildings housing for priestly families, and altars designed for elaborate offerings. These sanctuaries were not rural shrines, they were political institutions. For Amaziah, the arrival of a prophet from Judah carrying a message of judgment posed an immediate threat. Such a figure could undermine confidence in the monarchy and disrupt the unity that the sanctuary was meant to maintain. Amaziah's accusation reflects concerns common to ancient religious administrators. Prophets were often seen as challengers when their messages contradicted official doctrine. In royal courts across the ancient Near East, prophets who supported the king were welcomed, while those who warned of disaster or injustice faced opposition. Inscriptions from Assyria, for example, describe prophets delivering messages that affirmed military campaigns or divine support for rulers. But other texts reveal prophets who warned of judgment, and these individuals frequently clashed with the elite. Amos found himself in the latter category. His message did not strengthen the national narrative, it dissolved it. The priest accused Amos of conspiracy, alleging that his warnings endangered the stability of the realm. This accusation fits the broader historical pattern in which prophets who spoke of national collapse were treated not as spiritual advisors, but as political insurgents. Amos had no intention of overthrowing the monarchy, yet his predictions of judgment inevitably touched the political sphere. When he spoke of sanctuaries falling and houses collapsing, he threatened more than religious institutions. He threatened the ideological framework that supported the king's authority. Amaziah instructed Amos to flee back to Judah, insisting that he perform his prophetic activity there, far from Bethel's influence. This attempt to send him away reveals the boundary between sanctioned religion and prophetic critique. The priest assumed that prophecy functioned as a regional practice tied to location and cultural affiliation. But Amos's message operated on a different plane. His claim to speak on behalf of the divine transcended the borders drawn by kings and priests. To silence him by sending him home ignored the universal vision that underpinned his entire mission. Amos responded by clarifying the origins of his calling. He did not come from a lineage of prophets, nor did he belong to a guild trained in sacred speech. His background as a shepherd and cultivator emphasized the spontaneity and authenticity of his vocation. Throughout the ancient world, divine callings often appeared in surprising forms. Figures from humble origins tasked with delivering messages to kings or nations. The prophet's insistence that he had not chosen this role underscored the seriousness of his message. He stood before Amaziah not as a political dissenter or a religious rival, but as one compelled by a force beyond human institutions. The confrontation at Bethel also revealed the deep divide between prophetic and priestly perspectives. Priests maintained order through ritual, hierarchy, and tradition. Prophets, especially those outside the official structure, often emphasized ethical demands that challenged complacency. These tensions appear in writings across the Hebrew Bible, where priests and prophets sometimes work together, but more often clash. In the story of Amos, the divide is especially pronounced. The priest upheld a system that equated ritual activity with divine approval, while the prophet declared that such practices devoid of justice became meaningless. The implications of this confrontation extended far beyond Bethel. It highlighted a crisis at the heart of Israel's identity. If the sanctuary no longer represented divine favor, and if the rituals no longer assured blessing, then the nation's confidence in its future rested on fragile ground. The priest's attempt to silence Amos revealed an unwillingness to confront the structural injustices that had taken root. His role required him to preserve the status quo, even when that status quo endangered the people he served. Prophetic critique, on the other hand, sought transformation rather than preservation. Amos's subsequent proclamation against Amaziah and the sanctuary deepened the rift. He announced that the structures the priests supported would fall, and that the consequences of ignoring justice would reach into the priest's own household. These statements align with the prophet's broader message that moral decay corrodes every layer of society, from the lowly to the elite. While the language of prophecy often employs symbolic imagery, the historical trajectory of the northern kingdom confirms the gravity of these warnings. Within a generation, Assyria reshaped the region, dismantling political structures and dispersing populations. The sanctuary at Bethel itself provides an instructive example. Archaeologists studying northern cultic sites note that sanctuaries often stood until destroyed by invading armies or abandoned due to shifting political conditions. Bethel's fate remains a subject of debate, but evidence suggests that northern sanctuaries faced significant disruption during the Assyrian campaigns. Whether or not Amos witnessed any of these events, his warnings anticipated outcomes consistent with the historical record. His message, grounded in moral insight and divine mandate, aligned with patterns that scholars continue to trace in the archaeological landscape. The priest-prophet conflict also illuminates broader questions about authority in ancient Israel. Who held the right to speak for the divine? Who interpreted the meaning of national events? Who determined whether prosperity signaled blessing or concealed impending disaster? These questions reverberate through prophetic literature, and the story of Amos provides one of the clearest examples of competing claims. Official religion emphasized continuity and stability. Prophecy emphasized accountability and transformation. The tension between these perspectives shaped the spiritual history of the region. The confrontation at Bethel also marked a turning point in Amos's public reception. His message, once dismissed as the alarm of an outsider, now represented a direct challenge to institutional power. His critique of sanctuaries, festivals, and offerings struck at the heart of national identity. For many, the sanctuaries symbolized unity, continuity, and divine protection. To declare their downfall was to suggest that the foundations of the kingdom were weaker than they appeared. This suggestion proved intolerable to those invested in maintaining their influence. Yet, the prophet's warnings did not arise from cynicism or hostility. They emerged from a recognition that justice formed the core of the nation's calling. Without justice, rituals became hollow, traditions lost meaning, and prosperity became a veneer, masking deep fractures. The conflict with Amaziah illustrated how far the nation had drifted from this core. The priest, concerned with external stability, overlooked the internal decay that placed the kingdom in danger. The prophet, focused on ethical renewal, spoke truths that the sanctuary could not bear to hear. The significance of this confrontation lies not only in what was said, but in what it revealed. It exposed the fragility of institutions built on selective interpretation of tradition. It revealed the tension between maintaining power and acknowledging wrongdoing. And it demonstrated that divine messages often emerge from unexpected places, challenging assumptions held by even the most respected figures. When Amos departed from Bethel, his conflict with Amaziah became a symbol of the broader struggle between prophetic truth and institutional denial. The priest had attempted to silence him, but the message persisted. It spread through the region, carried by those who recognized the weight of his warnings. The tension between prophetic and priestly authority would continue to shape Israel's history, influencing future generations of writers, leaders, and spiritual seekers. As the story of Amos moves deeper into the unfolding narrative, the confrontation at Bethel stands as a pivotal moment. It marks the culmination of growing tension between the prophet's message and the kingdom's institutions. It reveals the resistance that emerges when truth threatens comfort, and it prepares the way for revelations even more profound, visions that will expose the full extent of the consequences approaching a nation unwilling to confront its own reflection. As Amos continued to challenge the structures of his time, his message turned increasingly toward the deeper roots of Israel's religious identity. The sanctuaries, with their rituals and sacrifices, had once symbolized the nation's devotion. Yet now, in the eyes of the prophet, those symbols had become distorted expressions of privilege, complacency, and false assurance. The heart of his accusation rested not simply on the existence of alternative worship sites, but on what those sites had come to represent, a misplaced confidence that ritual performance could secure divine favor irrespective of moral conduct. This theme emerges repeatedly in prophetic literature and reflects a tension visible in the archaeological and textual remains from the period. The religious life of ancient Israel was far more complex and divided than many modern readers assume. The northern kingdom possessed several prominent cultic centers, Bethel, Dan, Gilgal, and Beersheba among them. Each carried historical significance that shaped worship practices. Bethel had ancestral associations that reached back to early patriarchal traditions. Dan served as a strategic northern location for religious gatherings. Gilgal evoked collective memory related to earlier national narratives. Beersheba, though geographically in the south, played a role in popular pilgrimage. Archaeologists studying these sites discover altars, standing stones, incense installations, and other ritual objects indicating an active religious culture. Offerings of grain, oil, wine, and animals were common, and the sanctuaries hosted festivals that marked the agricultural year. These practices, however, masked a deeper problem. The prophets of Israel frequently critiqued ritual when it became disconnected from justice. The issue was not the presence of offerings or festivals, but the assumption that such acts alone fulfilled divine expectations. Amos insisted that ethical responsibility outweighed ceremonial observance. He warned that festivals could not erase oppression, that songs could not silence corruption, and that sacrifices could not compensate for systems that exploited the poor. His critique aligns with a theme found throughout early Jewish literature. Divine concern centers on the vulnerable, not on ritual performed for its own sake. The tension between ritual and ethics becomes particularly evident when examining the historical context. The northern kingdom, during the time of Amos, enjoyed significant economic growth. Trade routes extended across the region, linking Israel with Phoenicia, Aram, and even more distant lands. The wealth generated by these connections enriched elites who controlled commerce, land, and labor. Archaeological findings show luxurious homes decorated with imported ivory fragments, fine pottery from multiple cultures, and architectural features suggesting comfort and influence. Yet this prosperity did not extend to all. Many rural families struggled under debt, taxation, and fluctuating harvests. Seasonal work was unstable, and droughts or blights could devastate household economies. In such a climate, sanctuaries became places where the wealthy displayed their piety. Lavish offerings reinforced social status. Pilgrimages were not merely acts of devotion, they were public demonstrations of affluence. Priests, benefiting from these contributions, often supported interpretations of divine favor that aligned with elite interests. These dynamics are evident in the writings of Amos, who portrays religious leaders as indifferent to the suffering of the poor and blind to the moral decay spreading through the land. His warnings against trusting in pilgrimage sites reflect not a rejection of worship itself, but a rejection of worship divorced from responsibility. Gilgal, for example, appears in the prophet's critiques for reasons still debated among scholars. Some believe it had become a center of ritual activity that relied heavily on performance rather than ethical substance. Others suggest that its symbolic association with earlier national memories lent it a sense of security that masked present failures. Whatever the cause, Amos warned that visiting Gilgal would offer no protection from judgment. Similar warnings were directed at Bethel and Beersheba. These statements suggest that the reliance on sacred places created an illusion of divine approval that concealed urgent moral demands. The archaeological study of cultic centers underscores this complexity. At Tel Dan, excavations reveal a large sacred precinct with monumental structures, including a massive platform that likely supported a significant altar. The site's scale indicates its importance in national worship. Yet, despite its prominence, the sanctuary did not unify the nation in righteousness. Instead, it became part of a fragmented religious landscape that reflected political divisions and differing interpretations of tradition. Amos's critique highlights how sacred spaces, when co-opted by political agendas or stripped of ethical grounding, lose their ability to convey authentic spiritual meaning. The prophet's warnings also reflect broader, ancient Near Eastern patterns. Many cultures integrated religion with political authority, using temples to legitimize kings and stabilize societies. Rituals affirmed divine blessing upon rulers, while priests mediated between the spiritual realm and the state. In such systems, religious institutions often functioned to maintain order rather than challenge injustice. Amos disrupted this relationship by asserting that genuine obedience required confronting the structures that exploited the weak. His message separated divine endorsement from political power, insisting that prosperity without righteousness offered no protection from collapse. One of the most striking elements in the prophet's critique is his portrayal of divine response to hollow worship. Instead of accepting offerings, the divine voice rejected them. Instead of delighting in songs, the divine voice refused to listen. Instead of blessing festivals, the divine voice dismissed them as empty noise. This theme carries significant theological weight. It demonstrates that ritual, detached from ethical living, becomes an instrument of deception. Festivals designed to express gratitude turn into means of avoiding accountability. songs meant to celebrate divine presence become distractions that prevent people from acknowledging injustice. The prophet's message insists that divine patience has limits when rituals are used to shield wrongdoing. The mention of ivory houses and luxurious feasting further reveals the widening social divide. Archaeologists identify objects carved from ivory in several northern sites, indicating trade connections with Phoenician artisans and other Mediterranean sources. These objects were not merely decorative, they signified wealth and power. The prophet's condemnation of those who reclined on such adornments illustrates the moral tension between visible prosperity and hidden suffering. While elites enjoyed comfort, the rural poor faced economic hardship, displacement, and legal vulnerability. Amos's message emphasized that the divine concern lay not with those who controlled wealth, but with those who suffered under its weight. This disconnect between ritual confidence and ethical failure contributed to a broader illusion of national stability. Leaders likely believed that continued prosperity indicated divine approval, a common assumption in ancient societies. Archaeological evidence of strong fortifications and expanded trade routes suggests optimism within the northern kingdom. Yet, these signs masked underlying fragility. As societies grew more complex, internal inequalities increased, leaving them vulnerable to external threats. History repeatedly demonstrates that nations deteriorate when their moral and social foundations weaken, regardless of their economic achievements or military strength. Amos's critique of sacred spaces extended beyond their ritual practices. It questioned their ability to mediate divine guidance. The prophet insisted that truth did not reside in architectural grandeur or ritual complexity, but in ethical integrity. His emphasis on justice and righteousness reflected a broader prophetic theme that later shaped Jewish and early Christian thought. For Amos, the failure of the sanctuaries was not merely a theological concern. It was a cultural and political crisis. The kingdom's identity depended on its relationship to divine expectation. When that relationship faltered, the entire national structure was at risk. The prophet's voice carried implications for both leaders and common people. For the elite, his message undermined assumptions that wealth and ritual provided security. For the poor, it offered recognition of their suffering and affirmed their value. In societies where the vulnerable were often overlooked, the proclamation that divine concern centered on justice would have resonated deeply. This emphasis appears in legal codes across the ancient Near East, where care for the widow, orphan, and stranger served as fundamental ethical principles. Yet Amos insisted that Israel had failed to uphold these values, and that their neglect would bring consequences. The warnings directed at the sanctuaries also foreshadowed the impending geopolitical upheaval. The rise of Assyria, with its formidable military power and administrative reach, posed a threat that ritual devotion could not counter. Archaeologists uncover evidence of Assyrian domination across the region, including deportations, tribute demands, and the destruction of fortified cities. These developments reveal that the northern kingdom's confidence in its sacred spaces was tragically misplaced. When empires advanced, sanctuaries fell alongside political institutions. Amos's critique anticipated this reality, linking internal corruption with external vulnerability. The prophet's emphasis on ethical living continues to shape interpretations of his message. Scholars note that his teachings formed a foundation for later developments in Jewish thought, influencing discussions on justice, righteousness, and the nature of divine favor. His warnings against trusting in ritual without ethical substance echo throughout prophetic literature, appearing in the writings of Isaiah, Micah, Jeremiah, and others. These themes remain relevant for understanding the historical and spiritual landscape of ancient Israel. As the critique of sanctuaries unfolded, Amos did not abandon hope entirely. His call to seek good and pursue justice, though not quoted here in verse form, expressed the possibility of transformation. His message did not deny the importance of worship, but insisted that worship must flow from a life aligned with ethical truth. Without that alignment, sanctuaries could not preserve the nation from the consequences of its own choices. The growing tension between ritual assurance and ethical demand formed the center of Amos's argument. The sanctuaries that once anchored Israel's identity now stood as symbols of misplaced trust. Their rituals, though elaborate and culturally rich, could not mask the fractures spreading through the land. The prophet's critique exposed these fractures with unflinching clarity, preparing the way for the more vivid revelations that would follow, visions that would unveil the full extent of the nation's approaching crisis and the deeper meanings behind its unfolding history. As Amos's message expanded beyond Israel's internal corruption, it entered a realm that few in his audience expected, a sweeping portrait of divine sovereignty that encompassed not only Israel, but every nation under the sun. This perspective challenged one of the deepest assumptions within ancient identity, that a deity belonged primarily to the people who worshipped it, that divine power was localized, territorial, and bound to the fortunes of a single kingdom. Across the Near East, nations invoked their gods to justify military campaigns, secure harvests, legitimize rulers, and interpret omens. Deities watched over lands, cities, and dynasties. Yet the shepherd prophet from Tekoa proclaimed something profoundly different, that the divine guided the histories of all peoples, not only his own, and evaluated them according to a moral order that transcended borders and traditions. This idea was radical. Archaeological findings and ancient inscriptions reveal that kingdoms such as Moab, Aram, Phoenicia, and Assyria viewed their gods as intimately tied to their territory. Boundary stones invoked divine curses upon those who moved them. Royal inscriptions thanked patron gods for victories, assuming that divine presence did not extend far beyond the territory of the deity in question. When one kingdom conquered another, it was often interpreted as proof of the conquering deity's superiority. The idea that a single divine authority governed everything, from distant migrations to the rise of empires, challenged assumptions that had shaped Near Eastern thought for centuries. Amos's message reflected a worldview in which divine sovereignty was universal, ethical, and historically active. His audience, accustomed to hearing proclamations of divine favor assured through ritual, found themselves confronted with a larger and more unsettling vision. The divine had shaped the movements of other peoples just as surely as it had guided Israel. Traditions preserved in early Jewish literature reinforce this idea, emphasizing that the divine orchestrates the migrations of nations, establishes their boundaries, and oversees their destinies. Such texts reflect a theological horizon far wider than the territorial religions of surrounding cultures. The implications of this worldview were vast. If the divine governed all nations, then Israel could not claim exemption from moral scrutiny. The people could not assume that their rituals or lineage granted them immunity from judgment. Instead, they were part of a larger historical tapestry, woven by divine purpose, a tapestry in which justice, righteousness, and compassion formed the essential threads. Amos's proclamation shattered the comforting illusion that their relationship with the divine insulated them from consequences. Just as Damascus faced judgment for its brutality and Gaza for its violence, Israel would face judgment for its exploitation, injustice, and ethical failure. This universal perspective also reframed how listeners understood historical events. The prophet described past deliverances not to affirm national pride, but to demonstrate continuity between divine action and human responsibility. He reminded them that the divine had once brought Israel out of bondage, but also guided other nations in their migrations, peoples whose histories intersected with Israel's through trade, conflict, and shared geography. This perspective dissolved the sharp boundaries that separated chosen from other. It presented a moral framework in which every nation stood accountable, not just those regarded as adversaries. The idea that the divine brought other peoples from distant lands reflects themes found in early Jewish sources. Some texts describe migrations as divinely orchestrated movements that helped shape the cultural and political landscape. These traditions emphasize that no nation exists outside divine awareness or guidance. Archaeological research confirms large-scale population movements during the late Bronze and Iron Ages, including shifts in the Aegean, the Levant, and northern Africa. These migrations reshaped trade networks, introduced new cultural influences, and contributed to the rise and fall of kingdoms. Amos's message, in this light, resonated with historical developments that were unfolding across the region. By presenting a deity who governed all nations, Amos reframed Israel's identity from being the exclusive focus of divine attention to being one participant within a global moral order. This shift was not meant to diminish Israel's calling, but to redefine it. Their chosenness was not a shield, it was a responsibility. Divine election, in the prophet's understanding, demanded ethical living that reflected the character of the one they claimed to serve. Failing to uphold justice placed them under the same scrutiny applied to the nations they had previously judged. This vision of universal accountability explained why the prophet's earlier oracles included Damascus, Gaza, Tyre, Edom, Ammon, and Moab. He was not appealing to national pride by condemning foreign powers. He was demonstrating that moral evaluation operated beyond borders. These nations faced judgment not because they were enemies of Israel, but because they had committed acts of violence, betrayal, and cruelty documented in historical sources. Their fate served as warnings that divine justice extended to all peoples, including the nation that believed itself uniquely blessed. The universal perspective also provided context for the ecological crises Amos described: droughts, blights, plagues, and failed harvests. Ancient Near Eastern texts often portrayed natural disasters as signs that the cosmic order had been disturbed. In Mesopotamian literature, violations of justice led to famine and plague. Egyptian sources emphasized the necessity of maintaining balance to ensure the land's fertility. By describing environmental disruptions within Israel, Amos connected moral collapse with cosmic disorder, reflecting a worldview in which ethical choices influenced not only human society, but the stability of creation itself. The prophet's statements about justice rolling forth like a flood and righteousness flowing like a stream evoke natural imagery familiar to those living in the land. Seasonal floods brought both destruction and renewal. They reminded the people that certain forces once unleashed could not be controlled. By invoking this imagery, the prophet's message suggested that divine justice operated with similar power, cleansing corruption, overturning complacency, and restoring balance where human systems had failed. The universal scope of Amos's message also challenged the political assumptions of the time. Kings often interpreted military success as proof of divine approval. Victories brought confidence. Prosperity reinforced the belief that the divine favored their policies. Yet the prophet warned that such interpretations were dangerously shallow. The divine did not measure nations by their military strength or economic achievements, but by their treatment of the vulnerable. This principle appears in legal traditions across the ancient world, but Amos elevated it to a defining criterion for national survival. Historical evidence reveals that within a few decades of Amos's proclamations, the northern kingdom confronted the full force of Assyria, an empire whose methods were unforgiving and thoroughly documented. Cities fell, populations were deported, and political structures collapsed under the pressure of imperial expansion. Archaeologists uncovered destruction layers, administrative tablets, and inscriptions that attest to the thoroughness of Assyrian campaigns. The prophet's warnings about divine judgment were not speculative. They aligned with geopolitical realities that were already reshaping the region. Yet Amos did not portray the divine as a distant ruler orchestrating punishment from afar. His message revealed a deity intimately involved in the workings of the world, guiding history, confronting injustice, and calling for a transformation. The universal scope of divine activity served to broaden the listener's understanding of their place within a larger story. They were not isolated actors. They were participants in a network of nations, each accountable for its ethical choices. This portrayal of divine sovereignty appears in several strands of early Jewish thought, where creation, history, and moral law intertwine. Texts associated with wisdom traditions emphasize that righteousness upholds the world, while injustice threatens its stability. Apocryphal writings describe divine oversight extending to the ends of the earth, observing the actions of kings and common people alike. The prophet's message resonated with these ideas, presenting a vision of history governed by a moral order deeper than military alliances or territorial claims. The universal reach of Amos's proclamation confronted his audience with a difficult truth. The divine did not belong to them. They belonged to the divine. They could not manipulate favor through rituals, nor secure protection through festivals. Their standing depended on their ability to embody the justice that defined the character of the one who governed all nations. By insisting on this point, the shepherd prophet dismantled the illusion that religious identity alone guaranteed security. This shift in perspective also reshaped the meaning of Israel's history. Their deliverance from oppression, their settlement in the land, and their traditions of covenant and worship were not merely privileges. They were responsibilities. The same divine force that guided them out of bondage guided other nations across deserts, rivers, and mountains. Israel's story was part of a larger narrative in which every people moved according to divine purpose. This concept, though humbling, offered a deeper understanding of their role in the world. Amos's universal message continues to challenge readers and scholars. It invites reflection on how societies interpret divine favor, how they understand their place within history, and how they respond to the ethical demands placed upon them. His proclamation that the divine guided both Israel and its neighbors broke down cultural barriers and redefined what it meant to live under divine authority. It dissolved the comfort of national exceptionalism and replaced it with a profound call to justice. As the prophet's voice carried through the land, it revealed a tension between the world as people perceived it and the world as it truly was. Kings boasted of victories, merchants celebrated wealth, priests conducted rituals, farmers tended fields. Yet beneath the surface, a moral crisis simmered, one that threatened to unravel everything built upon it. The universal scope of Amos's message illuminated this crisis, revealing that no nation could escape accountability. All were subject to the same divine builder who held the plumb line of justice against the structure of human society. In the narrative unfolding around Amos, this universal proclamation formed the bridge between earlier critiques of injustice and the visions of collapse that would follow. It anchored his message within a broader historical and theological horizon, showing that nations rise and fall not by chance, but according to a moral order woven into the fabric of creation. The shepherd prophet had stepped into a world shaped by borders, rituals, and hierarchies, and declared that none of these defined the limits of divine sovereignty. This vision prepared the way for the final stages of his message, a revelation of what happens when a nation entrusted with justice abandons its calling and stands exposed before the universal judge who governs the destinies of all peoples. As the prophet's message continued to unfold, it moved into a territory that blended historical insight with an almost forensic analysis of societal collapse. Amos described a series of disasters: famine, drought, crop failure, pestilence, and military defeat, not as random misfortunes, but as signs of a deeper unraveling that affected every layer of life. These events served as both consequences and warnings, revealing that the society's ethical failures had already begun to manifest in visible, measurable forms. The prophet's descriptions resonate with archaeological, climatological, and textual evidence from the Iron Age, forming a picture of a kingdom struggling under pressures it could no longer ignore. The agricultural economy of ancient Israel functioned within a fragile environmental balance. Rainfall patterns were unpredictable. The land required careful stewardship. A single season of drought could devastate entire regions, and extended periods of dryness could lead to famine. Paleoclimatic studies examining pollen samples, lake sediments, and tree rings reveal fluctuations in climate during the 8th century that would have affected crop yields. Amos's references to withheld rain reflect real concerns in a region where survival depended on the early and late rains that sustained barley, wheat, grapes, and olives. When rainfall failed, economic and social structures faltered. The prophet also described drought that affected only certain cities while sparing others. This detail aligns with the patchwork pattern of rainfall in the Levant, where local variations can create severe disparities. Some towns might suffer catastrophic shortages, while neighboring areas remained relatively stable. Such inconsistencies often contributed to social tension, migration, and the breakdown of trade networks. In this environment, communities relied heavily on cooperation and equitable resource distribution. When justice collapsed, so did the mechanisms necessary for survival. Another disaster Amos described was the failure of vineyards, orchards, and grain fields. Diseases such as mildew, blight, and rust, along with infestations of locusts and caterpillars, were well known in the ancient world. Archaeological studies of agricultural terraces and storage facilities show that maintaining consistent yields required extensive effort. When harvests failed, the consequences extended far beyond agricultural laborers. Merchants lost goods to trade, priests received fewer offerings, landowners faced economic loss, and the poor, with minimal reserves, suffered immediately. Amos's descriptions form a cohesive picture of a society where environmental and economic stress converged to expose the weaknesses created by injustice. The prophet also spoke of sickness sweeping through the population, echoing the plagues described in earlier traditions. In many ancient societies, disease outbreaks were interpreted as signs of divine displeasure, and Israel was no exception. Environmental stress often contributed to the spread of illness, especially when drought forced people to use contaminated water sources or when food scarcity weakened immune systems. Historical records from surrounding civilizations describe plagues that devastated cities during times of political instability or environmental strain. Amos's references to such events reflect a global awareness of how interconnected moral, environmental, and social conditions could be. Beyond ecological disasters, the prophet addressed military defeat. This theme appears in royal inscriptions across the Near East, where kings boast of victories or lament losses. The Northern Kingdom's strategic location placed it in constant contact with powerful neighbors. Aram, Damascus, and Assyria posed continual threats. Archaeological evidence shows destruction layers in northern towns, indicating that military conflicts were not hypothetical, but frequent realities. Amos interpreted these defeats as consequences of moral collapse, consistent with covenantal themes found throughout Israelite literature. His message did not separate political events from ethical considerations. Instead, he saw them as intertwined. One of the most striking elements in Amos's portrayal of these disasters is his insistence that they were not merely punishments, but corrective interventions. Each event carried the implicit invitation to reconsider societal practices and turn toward justice. The prophet repeatedly emphasized that the people had not responded to these opportunities for change. Early Jewish writings often present adversity as a form of discipline intended to guide communities back to their foundational values. Amos built upon this tradition, interpreting crises as moments meant to reveal truth and foster transformation. Despite the mounting disasters, Amos described a population unwilling to recognize their significance. Their rituals continued. Their festivals remained elaborate. Their confidence in divine favor persisted. This disconnect reflects a dynamic seen in many ancient cultures, where religious performance served as a way to maintain social order rather than confront internal problems. The prophet's critique highlighted the danger of assuming that ritual could compensate for ethical failure. When the land withered, when sickness spread, when armies approached, the people continued to trust in the sanctuaries rather than addressing the injustices that had destabilized their society. The prophet's message also included references to pilgrimage practices that had become sources of false assurance. By traveling to sacred sites and performing prescribed rituals, many believed they could secure divine protection. Amos confronted this belief directly. Sacred geography could not preserve a nation that had abandoned its ethical obligations. Indeed, the prophet suggested that these very sanctuaries had become complicit in the corruption. Archaeologists identify layers of destruction in cultic centers from this period, reflecting the vulnerability of sacred spaces during times of political upheaval. The fall of such sites revealed that sacred structures were not immune to the forces that shaped the broader society. Another theme in Amos's warnings involved the breakdown of social cohesion. When disasters occur, droughts, famines, plagues, communities must work together to survive. But exploitation, corruption, and disregard for the poor weaken these bonds. The prophet described a society in which the elites continued to accumulate wealth, while ordinary families faced hardship. This imbalance strained the communal structures that should have supported resilience. Historical studies of ancient societies show that inequality often intensifies vulnerability during periods of crisis. Amos recognized this pattern and identified it as a core reason for the nation's impending downfall. The prophet also invoked historical examples of divine intervention to illustrate the continuity between past and present. He reminded the people of events in which they had experienced deliverance, not to affirm national pride, but to emphasize accountability. The same force that once protected them now confronted them with truth. This dynamic appears throughout Israelite tradition, where divine action is often portrayed as both protective and corrective. By referencing these past events, Amos framed current disasters within a larger historical context, showing that the nation's present struggles were not isolated, but part of an ongoing moral narrative. The environmental disasters Amos described also reflect broader ecological patterns in the ancient world. Studies of sediment layers, mineral deposits, and pollen samples reveal periods of drought that spanned multiple decades. These events affected civilizations from Egypt to Mesopotamia. In some cases, entire cities were abandoned as farmland became unsustainable. Amos's message placed Israel's struggles within this wider ecological context. Rather than interpreting drought and famine as isolated events, he connected them to ethical failures that disrupted the harmony between land, people, and divine expectation. In addition to natural and political disasters, Amos emphasized the failure of social rituals intended to restore balance. In many ancient cultures, ceremonies served to reconcile communities with their deities, reinforce collective memory, and reaffirm values. Yet, these rituals relied on sincerity and ethical alignment. When performed without justice, they lost their power. The prophet insisted that no offering could compensate for exploiting the poor, and no festival could erase violence committed against the vulnerable. This idea appears in legal traditions across the region, but Amos expressed it with unparalleled clarity. The narrative of disaster also reveals the anxiety that must have permeated the northern kingdom during this period. Archaeologists uncover evidence of hurried fortification efforts in some towns, suggesting that leaders recognized the threat of invasion. Storage jars from the era show signs of rationing or scarcity. Some settlements exhibit signs of abandonment, possibly due to economic collapse or environmental strain. Against this backdrop, Amos's warnings take on a heightened sense of urgency. He described not only potential crises, but ongoing realities that the people refused to confront. As the prophet detailed these disasters, he revealed a principle at the heart of Israel's calling. Justice was not simply one virtue among many, it was the foundation of their relationship with the divine. Without justice, society fractured. Without righteousness, the land suffered. Without ethical integrity, rituals lost meaning. This interconnectedness between ethics and survival shaped the entire prophetic message. The disasters that Amos described served as both symptoms and consequences of a deeper moral condition, one that threatened the nation's very existence. Despite the severity of his warnings, Amos maintained a thread of possibility. His repeated calls to seek good, pursue justice, and return to ethical living implied that collapse was not inevitable if the people responded. This tension between judgment and hope appears throughout Israelite literature. Yet, as the disasters accumulated, the window for transformation grew narrower. The prophet recognized that the nation stood at a threshold, and that further warnings would give way to declarations of irreversible consequences. The events Amos described formed a comprehensive picture of societal breakdown, environmental, economic, political, and spiritual. They revealed how injustice permeated every aspect of life and how the refusal to confront that injustice accelerated decline. The prophet's analysis was not merely theological, it was rooted in observation, history, and an understanding of how societies function. His warnings illuminated patterns that archaeologists, historians, and scholars continue to trace across ancient civilizations. As the narrative unfolded, the prophet's voice rose above the noise of festivals, the comfort of rituals, and the assurances of priests. He spoke into a world unraveling at the seams, urging a return to foundational truths. The disasters he described were not the end in themselves, but signs pointing to a deeper reality. A nation drifting from its purpose, standing on the brink of forces it could no longer control. From this vantage point, the next stage of Amos's message would not merely recount further warnings. It would reveal the full weight of the judgment approaching, a judgment shaped by history, ethics, and a divine order that held all nations accountable for the choices they made. As the warnings intensified and the people remained unmoved, Amos's message entered a final and formidable stage. What he had previously described through symbolic visions and historical analysis now emerged in stark, unmistakable terms. The collapse of Israel's structures, political, social, and religious, was no longer a distant possibility, but an approaching reality. The prophet's words, preserved in fragments of ancient tradition, reveal a portrait of national disintegration, consistent with what archaeology and history confirm about the final decades of the Northern Kingdom. His descriptions did not merely anticipate calamity. They mirrored the forces already gathering beyond the borders. One of the most pivotal revelations involved the fate of the sanctuary itself. What began as a critique of ritual complacency and institutional corruption now evolved into a declaration that the central places of worship would fall. This warning reflected more than theological dissatisfaction. It pointed to the vulnerability of structures deeply tied to political identity. Across the ancient Near East, sanctuaries were not isolated religious buildings. They were economic hubs, administrative centers, and symbols of royal legitimacy. Their destruction signified not only military defeat, but the unraveling of the entire ideological system that supported a nation. Archaeological evidence reveals that many northern cultic sites faced upheaval during the 8th century. Some were abandoned under threat of invasion. Others were destroyed as part of Assyrian campaigns. Excavations in regions such as Samaria and Hazor uncovered layers of ash, collapsed architecture, and fragments of ritual vessels that bear witness to violent interruptions. These findings align with the prophet's proclamation that sacred spaces, once the heart of national identity, would not withstand the pressures gathering on the horizon. The sanctuary at Bethel, though debated among scholars, likely faced significant disruption as the political landscape shifted. The prophet's message anticipated the symbolic weight of such an event. When the sanctuary fell, the illusion of divine endorsement collapsed with it. In addition to the fall of sacred sites, Amos described the scattering of the people, a theme that appears across ancient Near Eastern conquest narratives. The Assyrians, known for their administrative efficiency, frequently deported conquered populations to weaken local resistance and integrate them into the empire. Inscriptions from Assyrian rulers boast of relocating tens of thousands of individuals from captured regions. These deportations affected not only elites, but merchants, artisans, and entire communities. The Northern Kingdom's fate, as later historical records confirm, followed this pattern. Populations were dispersed, cities repopulated with foreign groups, and regional identities dissolved. Amos's warnings aligned with this imperial strategy, foreseeing a future in which Israel's cohesion would fracture under the weight of displacement. The prophet's final visions further illuminate the inevitability of this collapse. One vision described the divine standing beside the altar, commanding its destruction. This imagery carries profound significance. Altars symbolize stability, continuity, and the presence of the divine within the community. To envision their disintegration was to declare the end of the system that held the nation together. Comparable scenes appear in other ancient traditions, where the destruction of a temple marks the downfall of a city or kingdom. For Amos, the altar's collapse represented not only the judgment of religious institutions, but the exposure of the moral failures embedded within them. Amos also depicted attempts to flee that would prove futile, whether hiding in mountain clefts, descending into the depths, or seeking refuge among foreign nations. The people could not escape the consequences of their choices. This theme reflects a broader understanding within ancient thought that divine judgment reaches beyond geographical boundaries. It also aligns with historical realities. When the Assyrian Empire advanced, few places offered sanctuary. Their dominance extended across vast territories, and their administrative network ensured that resistance, flight, or rebellion carried severe consequences. The prophet's portrayal of inescapable judgment was therefore both theological and historically grounded. The language of collapse employed by Amos resonates with imagery preserved in early Jewish literature. Some texts portray the divine as measuring, shaking, or restructuring nations according to moral order. These writings emphasize that injustice creates instability, leading to forms of collapse that extend from social institutions to physical structures. The prophet's use of such imagery reflects an understanding that moral and material realities are intertwined. When a nation abandons justice, the structures built upon corruption eventually fall under their own weight. Another significant theme in the prophet's final warnings was the reversal of expectations. Many in Israel believed that the divine presence would ensure victory, prosperity, and protection. Rituals, festivals, and sacrifices reinforced this belief. Yet Amos asserted that the day many anticipated as a moment of triumph would instead bring darkness. This reversal challenges assumptions about divine favor, suggesting that the divine cannot be manipulated through ceremony. It aligns with prophetic traditions that redefine religious assurance, emphasizing that ethical integrity, not ritual performance, determines the future. Amos's portrayal of darkness carries both symbolic and historical meaning. Darkness often served in ancient literature as a metaphor for calamity, confusion, and defeat. It also reflected the terror of military invasion, when cities were overtaken in early morning hours or under siege conditions that extinguished familiar rhythms of daily life. Assyrian records describe campaigns that struck swiftly and decisively, leaving conquered populations disoriented. The prophet's imagery, therefore, captures both the spiritual state of the nation and the concrete realities of impending war. One of the most arresting elements in the prophet's final proclamations involved the famine, not of bread nor of water, but of hearing the divine word. This statement suggests that the people, long accustomed to ritual and prophetic guidance, would experience a profound silence. The idea aligns with early Jewish sources that describe periods in which divine guidance becomes inaccessible due to persistent disobedience. In historical terms, such silence reflects the loss of institutions, traditions, and communal identity following conquest and deportation. When populations were scattered and sanctuaries destroyed, the rituals and teachings that once shaped daily life became fragmented. Amos foresaw not only physical dislocation, but spiritual disorientation. The prophet also warned of social collapse, manifesting in internal turmoil. When a nation loses its ethical center, divisions multiply, class distinctions become entrenched, trust erodes, the vulnerable suffer disproportionately. Archaeological and historical analysis of societies under stress confirms these patterns. As resources grow scarce, competition intensifies. As external threats increase, internal fault lines widen. Amos recognized these dynamics and interpreted them through the lens of divine justice. The collapse of unity within Israel was not merely political, but moral, rooted in choices made over generations. One particularly vivid element of the prophet's warnings involved the use of mourning imagery. Amos depicted a nation grieving as if for an only child, a metaphor that conveyed the depth of loss approaching. In ancient cultures, mourning rituals for an only child represented the most devastating form of bereavement, reflecting both personal tragedy and the extinguishing of hope for future continuity. The prophet's use of this metaphor signaled that the approaching collapse would reach into every household and every corner of communal identity. It would not be a distant or abstract event, but a deeply personal experience of loss. Amos's descriptions of collapse also highlight the interconnectedness of various societal elements. The fall of the sanctuary represented the failure of religious life. Deportation reflected political collapse. Environmental disasters revealed neglected responsibilities toward the land. Social injustices exposed the breakdown of ethical systems. Economic exploitation undermined community stability. Each element contributed to a comprehensive portrait of disintegration that affected every level of the kingdom. The prophet saw these events not as isolated crises, but as interconnected symptoms of a deeper moral disorder. This understanding reflects broader themes in ancient Jewish thought, where the land, people, and divine presence operate within a unified framework. In such a worldview, ethical behavior maintains harmony among these elements, while injustice disrupts it. Amos's warnings emphasize this relationship, showing how ethical failure reverberated through the land itself. The droughts, pestilence, and crop failures he described were not mere punishments, but natural consequences of a fractured moral foundation. In the context of ancient Near Eastern empires, the collapse Amos described was especially tragic. The northern kingdom had enjoyed periods of prosperity and influence. Trade networks connected it with surrounding cultures. Military victories restored territory. Ritual life flourished. Yet this success masked vulnerabilities that became visible only when confronted with external pressures. The Assyrian Empire, with its advanced military strategies and administrative efficiency, capitalized on these weaknesses. The prophet's warnings anticipated how quickly a nation built on injustice could crumble when faced with the relentless advance of a powerful empire. As the narrative of Amos approached its final stage, the prophet's message revealed a sobering truth. Divine judgment was not an abrupt or arbitrary event. It was the culmination of choices, patterns, and systems that had shaped the nation over time. The collapse he described emerged from the accumulated weight of injustice, the refusal to heed earlier warnings, and the persistence in practices that undermined communal well-being. The prophet's voice did not merely predict catastrophe. It interpreted the forces leading to it, offering a lens through which the people could understand their unfolding reality. In this light, the narrative of Amos becomes a study not only of one nation's fate, but of the dynamics that affect societies across history. Injustice creates instability. Complacency blinds communities to danger. Ritual without ethical substance becomes deception. Prosperity without compassion becomes a trap. These themes emerge in civilizations across the ancient world and continue to resonate in contemporary discussions of social, political, and environmental collapse. As the prophet's message entered its final phase, he prepared to reveal a vision that balanced judgment with something unexpected, the possibility of restoration. Yet, before that final note could emerge, the narrative paused on the stark reality of collapse, a reality grounded in history, ethics, and the moral framework that governed the rise and fall of nations. In the final movement of Amos's message, a profound shift unfolds. For 9 segments of proclamation, warning, vision, and indictment, the prophet had revealed a world on the brink of collapse, a society whose moral foundations were failing, whose religious institutions had lost integrity, and whose political structures could not withstand the forces gathering against them. Yet, in the closing lines of his message, the tone transforms utterly. Without diminishing the gravity of judgment, the prophet offers a glimpse of a future shaped not by ruin, but by renewal. This transition from devastation to hope reflects a pattern found throughout early Jewish literature, where divine judgment and divine restoration operate in tension rather than contradiction. The restoration described by Amos does not erase the consequences of injustice. Instead, it reimagines a world rebuilt on ethical foundations. The vision begins with the portrayal of a fallen house associated with David. Though Amos prophesied in the northern kingdom, where allegiance to the Davidic dynasty was politically distant, his mention of this fallen house reflects a broader theological horizon. In early traditions, the Davidic lineage symbolized stability, justice, and continuity. Its collapse, whether literal or symbolic, represented the breakdown of ideals that once defined the people's identity. By invoking this imagery, the prophet connected the fate of the northern kingdom to a deeper narrative that transcended regional divisions. The restoration he envisioned would be rooted in principles that had guided the nation at its best moments: righteousness, compassion, and fidelity. To understand the significance of this promise, one must consider the historical context. The northern kingdom faced imminent destruction under Assyria, and the southern kingdom would later confront its own collapse under Babylon. Archaeological records confirm the magnitude of these events: the destruction of fortified cities, the deportation of populations, the dismantling of political systems. Yet, amid these upheavals, certain traditions persisted. Families carried ancestral memories into exile. Communities maintained their identity through shared stories, customs, and hopes. The promise of restoration found fertile ground in such context, offering a framework through which devastated populations could envision a future. The restoration Amos described encompassed agricultural renewal. He portrayed a land where mountains flowed with abundance, where vineyards and orchards flourished, and where the rhythms of planting and harvesting harmonized once more. This imagery resonates deeply with the ecological realities of the region. The land of Israel was known for its agricultural potential when tended responsibly. Terraced hillsides, irrigated fields, and well-managed orchards could sustain vibrant communities. Yet, environmental degradation caused by warfare, neglect, or population decline could reduce fertile land to ruin. The prophet's portrayal of restoration signaled not only divine blessing, but human responsibility to cultivate the land with wisdom and justice. In many ancient cultures, the fertility of the land was seen as a reflection of cosmic balance. When societies upheld principles of justice, the land responded with abundance. When injustice prevailed, the land suffered alongside the people. This worldview appears in legal codes, wisdom literature, and ritual texts from across the Near East. Amos's vision of restored agriculture thus represented more than improved living conditions. It symbolized the reestablishment of harmony between people, land, and divine expectation. The new creation he described emerged from a return to ethical integrity, a reorientation of society around values that sustained life rather than exploited it. The prophet also envisioned a time when cities rebuilt from ruins would stand secure, when people would dwell in homes they constructed with their own hands, and when vineyards planted by renewed communities would yield fruit for generations. This imagery contrasts sharply with the disruptions of exile, where communities were uprooted, cities demolished, and identities fractured. Archaeological evidence from post-exilic periods demonstrates how populations returning to the land rebuilt in stages, first repopulating villages, then restoring agricultural systems, and finally re-establishing centers of governance and worship. The process was neither quick nor easy, but it reflected the resilience of a people who carried hope through displacement. Amos's portrayal of restoration also contained a universal dimension. Just as his earlier proclamations emphasized divine sovereignty over all nations, his closing vision suggested that renewal was not limited to a single group. Rather, it implied a broader reconciliation, a transformation that touched both the land and the relationships among peoples. Early Jewish texts, particularly those composed during exilic and post-exilic periods, expand on this theme, portraying a future in which nations recognize the ethical principles upheld by the divine and participate in a world shaped by justice. While Amos did not elaborate extensively on this universal aspect, the seeds of it appear in his emphasis on moral order that transcends borders. The transition from judgment to restoration also reflects an important theological principle. Divine justice aims not at destruction, but at healing. The collapse of the northern kingdom, though devastating, would not signify the termination of the divine narrative. Instead, it served as a catalyst for transformation, a moment in which injustice could no longer persist unchallenged. The restoration Amos described was not a return to previous conditions, but the creation of something new, an ideal grounded in ethical responsibility and renewed relationship with the divine. This theme of renewal emerges in other prophetic writings. In texts associated with Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and later apocalyptic literature, restoration often includes agricultural abundance, social harmony, and spiritual renewal. These visions reflect a consistent pattern in ancient Jewish thought, the belief that divine judgment clears the ground for new life. Amos's portrayal aligns with this tradition, yet it remains distinct in its emphasis on ethical foundations. Without justice, restoration would be hollow. Without righteousness, renewal would lack substance. The prophet's vision insists that the new world must be shaped by the values that the old world had abandoned. The promise of restored vineyards, rebuilt homes, and replanted gardens resonates deeply with the emotional experience of exile. For those displaced from their land, the ability to plant and harvest once more symbolized reclaiming identity and stability. Agricultural labor was more than economic activity. It embodied continuity with ancestors, connection to the land, and participation in a story larger than oneself. By emphasizing these elements, Amos spoke not only to his contemporaries, but to future generations who would experience exile and long for return. The prophet's closing vision also challenges interpretations of divine judgment as final or absolute. Though the northern kingdom fell, the narrative of Israel did not end. Communities survived, traditions persisted, and the hope for restoration endured. Amos's message anticipated this resilience. His warnings confronted the present, but his promises pointed toward a horizon where justice, righteousness, and compassion shaped new communities. In this sense, Amos contributed to a theological framework in which destruction serves as a prelude to renewal. The closing lines of the prophet's message highlight another key theme: the permanence of restoration. The people would be planted once more in their land, never again to be uprooted. This assurance must be understood in its ancient context. Uprooting was one of the most traumatic experiences a community could endure. Deportation fractured families, disrupted traditions, and severed connections to the land. The promise of permanent planting offered a profound sense of security and continuity. Though history would unfold with further complexities, the ideal presented by Amos remained a touchstone for interpreting divine faithfulness. The concept of being planted permanently, also reflects agricultural metaphors common in early Jewish literature. Seeds planted in fertile soil symbolize stability, growth, and the potential for future generations. Trees deeply rooted withstand storms and droughts. Gardens cultivated with care flourish year after year. These images communicate resilience and hope, revealing how the prophet envisioned a future shaped by sustained ethical living. The land, once wounded by injustice, would become a place of flourishing under renewed stewardship. Amos's final message emerges as a profound statement about the nature of history. Nations rise and fall, empires expand and contract, societies flourish and decline. Yet, through these cycles, the moral order remains constant. Justice sustains communities, injustice destroys them. The prophet's narrative demonstrates that divine engagement with history operates not through arbitrary intervention, but through principles that uphold human dignity and social harmony. When these principles are embraced, restoration becomes possible. When they are ignored, collapse follows. The restoration envisioned by Amos did not deny the suffering that preceded it. It did not minimize the consequences of injustice or the devastation of collapse. Rather, it acknowledged these realities while offering a vision of what could emerge from them. The people would rebuild, not merely by reconstructing walls and houses, but by re-establishing an ethical foundation that aligned with the divine order governing all nations. In this way, the narrative of Amos stands as both warning and promise. It confronts societies with the consequences of moral negligence, yet it also offers hope rooted in transformation. The prophet spoke into a world shaped by instability, empire, and inequality, urging his listeners to recognize the forces shaping their destiny. His final words remind readers that the story does not end with collapse. Renewal is possible if justice becomes the foundation upon which new communities are built. The closing vision of Amos thus binds together the themes that have shaped his entire message: universal accountability, the inseparability of ethics and worship, the vulnerability of institutions built on injustice, and the enduring possibility of restoration. What began with a shepherd prophet observing the tensions of his time concludes with a vision of hope grounded in the same moral order he spent his life proclaiming. The collapse of the northern kingdom would become a historical reality, recorded in inscriptions, archaeological strata, and collective memory. Yet the hope articulated by Amos transcended that moment, offering a framework through which exiled and displaced communities could understand their suffering and envision a future. His words remain a testament to the resilience of those who embrace justice and seek renewal even in the aftermath of devastation. In this final vision, the prophet's journey reaches its culmination. The warnings have been spoken, the consequences have been revealed, and yet, at the edges of destruction, a new beginning emerges, one rooted in the enduring truth that justice, compassion, and righteousness are the foundations upon which any lasting future must stand.